Well,
Where?
yeah, thanks, Bob, for helping to and agreeing to have a chat with me. I'm basically interested to think about um, your point of view on a few things. I've got some questions, but obviously we had a chat as well, and it may be an extension of the conversation we've had. And we sort of chatted a bit about the world religions paradigm, the future of religious education, and from your point of view, I mean, a good point of departure might be to ask you whether you think the world religions paradigm is still dominant in the RE that happens in your neck of the woods? Is it something that you think is part and parcel of the way the subject is conceived by most teachers?
I suppose if I was honest, I'd say that one of the difficulties in generalizing about English religious education is um, it is quite diverse,
Mm,
and so and so and so I wouldn't want to suggest that I have a 360-degree perspective of the diversity of forms that it takes across the local authorities and across, particularly now that you've had a lot more experimentation going on among academy chains, and as they've had relative degrees of freedom around curriculum design, and then also the historic privileges that schools of a religious character get in having their own. So therefore, you have diocesan diversity, and you also have denominational diversity, Catholic Church, Church of England
mm,
context, and so on. So there's a sense in which it's kind of it's dangerous to talk in terms of what happens in classrooms definitively. If you were to look at the way in which GCSEs are ordered, so take some external examinations, and
mm,
you look at the sorts of, if you like, and then if you look at the operating assumptions that seem to be behind some of the discussions about what local agreed syllabuses ought to have, the sort of then I think you do tend to see the presence of a world religions paradigm, insofar as that the hangers on which conversations about RE seem to happen seem to be, presuppose that. So those hangers include who might be represented, who might be considered an appropriate representative on a local agreed syllabus sort of group, or what might be the range of content that would be considered appropriate for Ofqual to approve for an examination. Okay, so the sorts of things they're
mm,
going to start saying seem, and the sorts of even the terminology that's going to describe the sorts of things within a religion um, all fit that paradigm. Now, um, one possible reason to be hesitant about that is the language may fit, but what fills the language, it perhaps is another question. So
mm.
maybe there are some sort of divergences, but but I think that broadly speaking, there is a bit of a kind of marriage between a notion of world religions as being the um, ethical way of exploring religion in the present time, in a time of diversity. So there is actually a kind of, if you like, a political, ethical acceptance that world religions is the way to go, because that's appropriately diverse and because that's appropriately representative. Now I say
Mm.
that, and then there are lots of interest groups who want more representation.
Sure.
So the world religions paradigm partly is also about a notion of representation and diversity that you see then being present in structuring systems, like who can sit on the local degree syllabus, and or what would constitute the range of appropriate choices within an exam, an external exam.
Yeah, and the development of multi-faith, diverse religious education was indeed to precisely do that, to be broader, to be more inclusive, and along comes the world religions paradigm, which
Yeah.
sets up these traditions as discrete, homogeneous, stable entities, which sort of are operating, and then so you have X number of weeks on this tradition, X number of weeks on or classes on that tradition, and that tends to be, I guess, the prevailing manner of organising curricula. Even though I accept your caveat on that, that it's very hard to answer the empirical question of what's actually happening in all the schools. But still, it seems that notion of the discrete, the homogeneous, stable, structural quality of these traditions is still there, right?
Yeah, and I think that the clearest indicator of that would be in the recent round of, when I say recent, in the last 10 years, there has been a curriculum reorganisation that was marked by the arrival of the departure of the new Labour government and the arrival of a what was then a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government. So that then triggered a review, and part of that review also looked at RE and the exams for religious studies. And you can say that at that point those markers were retained. In fact, you could argue they were strengthened insofar as there had been a great deal of what you might call social issues and ethical issues that had predominated in previous curricula, whereas in the last 10 years the drift has been to be more specifically religious content, falling under categories that might be recognizable as related to the world religions paradigm. So you could argue that there was a period of time where actually social issues and ethical issues predominated rather more than the world religions paradigm in the 2000s. I haven't sort of written that argument out, but I think that there's a case to say yes to your basic question. There are outliers, and the outliers exist with some local degree syllabuses that have really tried to do a lot of work to change that. And there, you would see interesting comparisons if you were to look at Hampshire or Birmingham's local degree syllabuses. And there are most recently Norfolk, which sought to bring a multidisciplinary approach. An explicit sort of, if you like, a starting point that was trying to say we're going to have some social science, we're going to have some philosophy, we're going to have some theology, or some form of that. And there is of course what sectors like the Catholic sector does, which is although it has studied other religions, does not simply divide up the time evenly between a certain number of world religions. It majors on Catholic Christianity, although under our new GCSEs in England, everybody studies two religions. So that is another marked feature of a change, but still within the world religions paradigm, right? So it's still working within that sort of paradigm, broadly speaking, I would say.
So that's been my perception, and I've become very, very interested recently in the relationship between the academic study of religion in the universities in Britain, across Europe, and how RE as a subject in schools is framed, and the relationship between those things. And there are various scholars and who've discussed that relationship, and it's particularly interesting recently. Well, since 2016 publication of a book of After World Religions, deconstructing the world religions paradigm within the academic study of religion. And that's been quite a long-standing process in universities and research within academic research on religion, is to complicate the terms religion itself and its sort of hegemonic 19th century construction, formulation of what it means to be a religion among different religions. So how all that conversation relates to RE is really interesting to me. I'm tempted to think about this in terms of formulating something along the lines of After World Religions, calling it After Religious Education, so a project around after religious education. But in a way, the core report from 2018 is sort of moving in this direction, of course, renaming the subject potentially, or proposing to rename the subject to religion and worldviews. And so it seems as though the core report is pushing in that right direction, in the sense of complicating the terms of world religions and so on. So from your point of view, I guess I'm interested to know, is that the case? Is it gone far enough? And why do you think we haven't yet seen a change in governance on that yet? Is that a simple question?
So first part of that question, I would say yes. The core report and the conversation around the core report and the responses to it and adjuncts to it, so of which there are numerous now, I think is a indication of a recognition of a need to well, you could put it into the category. You could put it into the category of an after-world religions paradigm, or you know, a sort of or after religious education sort of paradigm inference, I suppose. The only thing to say is I think that it would be important to recognise as factors urging that change, not a sudden recognition of the interesting work being done at the religious studies higher education level. I'm afraid to say
No. I'm
I
glad
think
you.
there were two clear motivations, and one was a significant concern about the collapse and take up of the subject at in secondary schools, so a decline, numerically measurable decline and most particularly a decline in where schools had relative freedom around their curriculum. There were a lot of secondary schools dropping the subject or dropping the numbers of teachers they had. That was the indicator that you could find. It became, you know, so you got a pretty clear indication of what was going on without any change in any legal structure, but it was just other freedoms or constraints or pressures on schools led to it. So there was that concern, and secondly, there was the clear change in, and I would say here the awareness of the growing sense of distance between affiliation to established world religions and the young in particular, and the conversation around sort of unbelief and the work, the projects like Understanding Unbelief, and the people like Lois Lee have done a lot of work on, you know, understanding the nons. So there was a sort of there were those factors created an urgency to sort of try and address that problem that sort of certainly outside of the outside schools of a religious character, you had a very significant dropping off of interest and a very significant question mark about the nature of the subject being asked. That, of course, coincided with acute political instability at a general system-wide level. So, in my own mind, probably that general it was not an optimal time to, you know, for a government to be particularly interested in bringing about what would be quite challenging changes, because it would involve quite a difficult negotiation with the major stakeholders of the subject. And the major stakeholders of the subject are religious communities. I'm not saying they're the only ones, or I'm not saying whether they should or shouldn't be, but and some people have got clear views on all of that. But here's the problem, which is, you know, what does a government do? Because it hears stakeholders. Stakeholders are the carriers. They're also the investors as well. So and part of the question is the nature of the problem becomes quite difficult from a political perspective, because you might say that intellectually we understand, in terms of both intellectually but also in terms of representation, we understand that the population and the intellectual understanding of religions has moved, but actually that is not reflected by a new group of stakeholders. That the stakeholders remain the stakeholders that they always have been, and therefore where is the political motivation to disrupt it, right? So that presents a sort of a problem, in that any proposed solution will only have complainants. You know, so why, you know, and therefore the challenge really became, I think, one of convincing the stakeholders it was in their best interests. And that project, I don't think has been successful yet. So I think there's tended to be more of a reaction against those stakeholders, and there hasn't been an attempt to sort of understand why it might be in their interests.
And do you think that's partly because of a sort of suspicion or concern about the, as I've framed it previously, the academic study of religion being a different thing to what RE ought to be doing? So there is this kind of social scientific kind of examining religions as a second order subject, as a subject where one places oneself outside of the tradition. And I can well imagine that you know, the stakeholders that you mentioned feel some disconcerting reaction to that.
Well, not only a disconcerting reaction, I think there is an intellectual suspicion of it. So there is a suspicion of the idea that that a neutral study has replaced a biased study. They would simply say one worldview. I mean, here the worldview language is useful to just borrow temporarily for the sake of convenience. One worldview has replaced another worldview. That the rise, and this is the stuff that kind of there's kind of the rise of social sciences. It was not there's not an accidental relationship between the rise of social sciences and the specific rejection of certain sorts of religion orientation, understandings of knowledge, right? So you can't, and if you were to and the other thing to understand is that some of those stakeholders are quite wedded to an intellectual understanding of their subject. So I always remember Professor Ant Towie at St Mary's will say, the first thing you would do is you'd study philosophy and then you'd study theology. In other words, there was a kind of an intellectual formation. So there is something else that is not just the social sciences, right? So when investigating kind of questions that are sort of existential, it can't be just the social sciences, because the social sciences can't answer enough of the questions that would merit wanting to be asked. So but that's not to say that your other thing, which is a bit of a suspicion, is also the case, because sort of universities are just stuff full of people who think one way, aren't they? As we've been told for years. I mean, that's the caricature, isn't it? And are more critical of, So there's also a little bit of that going on. We can't trust the academics, because the academics sort of are not to be trusted.
Right.
There's a little bit of that.
No, I totally get this. So I myself, some of my previous work has been about trying to show that the so-called impartial social scientific framing of religion is by no means impartial, or the philosophical framing of religious debates in for instance philosophy of education is by no means neutral. That the framing of the relation between religion and education is historical, is always contextual, and it's so important that we as academics take great account of that, or indeed as religious people we take account of that, and so I would love to see a conception of science, or let's say that's why I don't really like talking about the scientific study of religion, because the phrase the scientific study has the wrong connotation in English, and that's why I use the phrase the academic study of religion, and I'm not sure if that entirely gets over the problem, because we still have that ambivalence, as you've just kind of hinted at, about what the academic study means. But an academic study of religion doesn't stop with the social scientific analysis. Of course, it includes cognitive science, it includes historical sciences, hermeneutics, philosophy, theology, all of those disciplines coming together. And I would imagine that when we ask ourselves what ought to be the foundation for the subject of religion and worldviews, taking of course account of the stakeholders that you've described, we could think about the academic study of religion, but in the broadest terms that I've just outlined, that isn't just social scientific, because indeed that is sort of one-dimensional, but is theological, philosophical, hermeneutical, literary, cognitive, and all those dimensions.
Yeah, I think I'd broadly agree with that, and I think that academic is a better word to use. And it's interesting when words are used, they're often freighted with things, aren't they? So sometimes the word critical can be used, and critical is often freighted with different sorts of presumptions. And there's been some discussion. This is a kind of conversation that Trevor Cooling sometimes have to provoke, which is really about recognition or the acknowledgement of positionality and whether that comes into it or not. And he has a similar set of questions to the ones you were posing of the presumed neutrality, in that sort of he precisely identifies that as one of the reasons why, when you talk about an academic study, and then you disassociate any personal dimension, he starts to become suspicious, because he thinks, because of the presumption that goes along with that, the presumed, almost like a kind of colonial perspective. I tend to drift into that sort of language.
Absolutely.
That I'm now going to describe what you really are from the neutral position that I have, as opposed to the biased position that you have. You know?
What's so important is that religious studies is precisely engaged in that very reflection. So Mallory Nye's work on the racist, historical, hegemonic, colonialist kind of structure of the study of religions is a case in point. It kind of draws attention to the sort of lack of the recognition of positionality that pertained to a study of religions approach at a particular period. And indeed, the recognition of positionality, or what we might call hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is central to the academic discipline of religious studies, that we need to sort of ask ourselves, how am I looking? You know, what am I bringing to my understanding? You know, what. So I think that's absolutely critical, to think of that as part of the academic study of religion.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't have a conversation about something like decolonizing the curriculum if you're not prepared to recognize the existence of positionality, and if you think that the answer is correcting the mistakes and then making sure you are properly neutral, you've probably already sown the seeds of your future disaster in, because actually it's not clear to me that we will achieve that, because as long as there is a growing population of interesting sort of people living in different contexts and different situations, think how radically many of our values have shifted just by the presence of a pandemic, that suddenly covering ourselves has become normative, when it was outrageous in many Western liberal democracies until very recently, something a bone of massive contention. Or think notions like inclusion and being with one another have suddenly become a threat to our survival, as opposed to the very thing that we must promote all the time. You know, so this kind of radical so it's the limitation of our context that tends to lead us into thinking that we have a position of total awareness and understanding, and and that is our downfall. I think I'm right with you on all of that.
Well, so this is a principle then of thinking through how the new subject, or the subject of religion and worldviews, whatever you want to, however we want to discuss it, it could be thought through, is that a fundamental principle I would want to call historical consciousness. That is to say that we go on an educational journey to understand something else, and a critical dimension of that, looking at the other, is about what it says about our own self-understanding, what we bring to that subject, how we frame that other. So historical consciousness is the capacity to see the contingency, the historicality of our own perception, and I think that is what RE, or religion and worldviews, ought to fundamentally be about. It ought to fundamentally be about helping students coming to see that the way that they are delivered into the world, the worldview that they absorb in their early years, is part and parcel of a historical formation, and perhaps it might have been otherwise. And that's not to diminish their tradition, their culture, their background, but just to understand it in a context.
And I think that one of the dangers there is reading that as a weakness of that of that emergence. In other words, you say, it's like you're scoring points for the relativists, so by making that claim, what you're really doing is knocking against the false absolutists. You're scoring points for the relativists, and you're sort of building in, therefore, the argument against truth and against people who seek truth or seek to assert truth. I think that's a mistake.
So do
Because
I.
I think that I would say it's learning. It teaches you how to read your formation and your intellect, and that empowers you. And it is not about belittling it. It is sort of the reverse of that, because you take really seriously that formation. And this is where I tend to get, when talking about worldview, this is why I tend to get quite hermeneutical in the language, and I like to use language and the kind of the sort of, you know, the language around language, grammars of knowing, because I think that is a helpful way of understanding the knitting process that sort of happens in formation. Um, and then you recognize the significance of context change that people experience in their life, right? I mean, we experience contextual change, and then that forces us to think again about how we are, and we have to then and what you know, and again, that's not that's not a disservice to what we've brought. It is actually about the process of surviving and living in the moment, and
Yeah.
and dealing with the challenge of now. And I think you can see that as being part and parcel of cultures and traditions that have survived. Their need to respond to change, sort of an adaptation of tradition. I mean, you kind of, you know, I would say you see it in the generations of literature that form this sort of, you know, the text in the Bible is a story of precisely that, again and again and again, over a period of certainly many centuries, if not longer, if we think some of those stories have mythic and are and you know, sort of a kind of date from ancient experience, you know, in oral traditions, for example. So there's a sort of kind of sense in which that is a yeah, I simply don't see that as a threat, or and as a threat to the notion of seeking commitment, or indeed living in community. But I recognize it can be spun, and if it's spun in a certain way and used in a more political fight, then we lose the educational possibility from it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to invoke the ideas of Paul Ricoeur at this point, because he has a lovely uh, way of talking about the journey, if you like, the journey of formation from a kind of what he calls a first naivety, which is a kind of pre-critical absorption in one's tradition, where one is kind of just enfolded in the sort of truths of one's culture, which inevitably, in the processes of growing up, go through episodes of alienation or distanciation or critical encounters. And that might be, we go traveling, we might meet someone who's different, whatever form that takes. We, all of us in growing up, go through processes of educational alienation. And I want to use the word alienation in a positive context in this way, in the sense that it then allows us to come to what Paul Ricoeur calls a post-critical second naivety, which is a second return to sort of the stories of our youth, but in a kind of, let's call it, sophisticated, or let's say more developed, or more critical,
Yeah.
or more.
I would say multidimensional.
Yeah.
I would say multidimensional, in that we now see that the layers, like I often use the analogy of the cliff walking on, because I have fond memories of walking in Pembrokeshire, but when you're walking on the cliff, you see the path beneath you, but when you round those wonderful promontories, which there are many along that coastline, you see at certain points you see the different layers of formation beneath the path, and you realize that the ground on which you walk is in fact comprised of multiple layers. And I think that second naivety is a developing awareness, where you almost re-embrace the initial naivety, but with a new insight. And therefore it's not there's not a presumption of departure or conversion or change, although clearly with some individuals that does happen. What there must be is some attempt to assimilate, if you're going to continue you have to reassimilate in some way the that with which you were brought up into and that
Yeah,
which you now perceive,
yeah.
and to do that you have to hold layers together, and you find ways of doing that.
Yeah, I think Ricoeur uses the word appropriation or reappropriation, but the moment, this educational journey that all of us undergo in some way, and you know, we might even use Campbell's notion of the hero's quest or something like that. But anyway, that also introduces all sorts of other problems. But anyway, the idea of a sort of educational journey that we undertake, what I think is might have something to do with the resistance that we find is that alienation is uncomfortable. It is disconcerting. It is troubling. We don't always know whether we will, as it were, pass beyond that critical phase. And although Ricoeur uses the phrase "beyond the desert of criticism, we are called again." So we're called again post-critically, he suggests, but we don't know that. And so when we go on our educational journey, I remember when I was 18 years old, sort of coming to terms with the sort of demise, let's say, of certain kind of principles of faith or community that I had attached to as a child, coming to terms with the fact that those were no longer present, and that I wasn't quite sure what that meant. Where was I going? Where would I end up? So on this kind of journey, we're not sort of guaranteed that where we're going to end up. So I think there is an understandable worry that this kind of educational journey that we go on doesn't have a kind of clear destination. And I think that may be why the stakeholders of religion and worldview sort of think to themselves, well, we need to ensure that our children end up where they need to end up, which is, you know, back in the fold, or you know, at least an appreciation for what it is that we do.
Yeah, and I think it's a, you know, we could be critical of that worry, and we could be sort of dismissive of it as not taking seriously enough the essential educational purpose, or we could say, isn't that it's almost like the parent's perspective, isn't that the sort of the post-critical sort of you know, second naivety, looking back at those who are at an earlier point of departure, and sort of having that sort of tension that you have, which is you want freedom for your child, but you don't want them, but you also want them to be safe,
The
and
right thing.
the right freedom. So you have this terrible gamble, which everybody has to gamble with. So you're conflicted with your instincts as to how you kind of respond to that. If you are a guardian of a community, then the individual's freedom could lead to the end of your community as it dissolves. So and yet, if you raise a wire around your community, then that itself will destroy, or could destroy, your community, or might transform it into something that I would worry about. So so there's a sort of a kind of, you know, there's a sort of there's, you know, we should understand the reasonableness of the concern, and take it seriously, I think, because the subject needs to have stakeholders, and here I would differ from those who want to excise the stakeholders, because there have to be stakeholders, and because you need champions for your subject. You need champions for your subject, because otherwise it won't find a space. And if it doesn't find a space, then the ladder that leads, the sort of ladder of intellectual development, begins to fragment. So I lean that way, but I recognise that you know, others don't.
And I wonder whether the stakeholders, as they're normally conceived in that way, would embrace this move to the academic study of religion. I mean, that's a question we've already touched on, and I guess there's no simple answer to it. It depends how we think of the academic study of religion, and it depends on the particular stakeholders that we're talking about.
and that's exactly right. So I think that there are, you will find amongst them, I mean, you know, my experience, and I've worked more closely with the two established churches, and in different ways, their educationalists and religious representatives, and of course you find complexity and diversity within. Of course you will, and also my experience is a pretty sophisticated understanding. I mean, you know, I don't these are not monochrome monoliths. They're much more complex, and they're and there's a sort of you know, there are a series of kind of you know, practical challenges, which actually I think relate to some of the stuff that we've talked about before, and that in the documents that you've shared with me, about the practical challenges of how you deal with the curriculum, and how you what decisions you make about the curriculum, how you manage you know, questions like your question of the reduction, you know, what constitutes a reasonable reduction and a successful reduction of the curriculum. And we're very mindful of some of the problematics around the world religions paradigm for how it treated the knowledge of the curriculum and what it ended up doing, and in terms of the kind of, you know, quality of the experience with whatever we might call knowledge, sort of as a result of some pretty sharp and sort of chunking into, you know, categories that we now see as not really being fit for purpose, but we're left with the legacy of, because they proliferate our language, and that actually produces real challenges. And it produces real challenges whether you're talking mainly within, you know, one religious tradition, such as trying to teach, you know, Catholic Christianity and some other religions too, but you're giving, you know, you've then still got this enormous tradition. What do you choose to teach? You know, that it's huge. It's kind of very old, so it's got a lot in it, and it's also very diverse work globally. So what do you choose? So you come back to that sort of challenge.
Yeah. And there's a temptation for completeness in all of these things, a temptation to sort of represent the whole of the world, and I think that's just, I mean, educationally speaking, I think we'll move to the educational question now, then, which is, I think we agree then that sort of just expanding a curriculum to include more and more in a religion and worldviews context, so more isms, where do we draw those lines? How does that work? Is complicated. It doesn't sound quite right. But then, what principles allow us to be inclusive and selective? And that's my question now. Is as I'm thinking about the question of being inclusive and selective, I'm thinking the fundamental principle of curricula has to be thought through, has to be established. And we've already talked a bit about historical consciousness as being one of those fundamental principles. In other words, helping children to recognize the journey that they're going to go on in their own lives, even though we don't quite know what that journey is, that there will be one, that something's going to happen. So the next sort of question is to do with that, you know, how we provide selections that are apertures that allow an expansive view that represent, but that they are inclusive, that are acknowledging those diverse traditions. Have you got any initial?
Well, I mean, I often think about that question. I think about it in terms of the idea of the library, and whether you're teaching and reading, in terms of reading, and what books you should read. What books should we read in any, well, in English, you could say, but what books to read and what books not to read. And you know, reading a book is important. It's important that you read the book, right? That you read it and you get to the end. It's not enough just to teach people about library categories. You know, I could tell you how the sort of Dewey Decimal System works, and I could show you pictures of libraries and show you pictures of the titles of books, but none of that would ever tell you what it is to read a book. So you got to read some books, but you can't read all the books. There are too many books. But also, you don't want to just teach children about the book that they've read. You want them to know there's a library. right? Because there is a library, and we know that there's a library, and there are lots of books. And so we've got these two extremes. One is you just teach them there's a book, and they never know about the library, and the other is you just teach them there's a library, and they never know what it is to read a book. And we're trying to find a way in the middle there. Okay, we're trying to work out what's the balance. And when it comes to questions like representation and sort of inclusivity, so that those are harder, and they're harder because we know more about what we haven't done very well. We know that sort of there are dangers in kind of summarification. We can easily become quite colonialist because of our choices. We can easily provide quite shallow experiences because students don't get to wrestle in depth with stuff, and the people, we can reduce to bullet pointizations, to sort of long lists, so those are all our pitfalls. We must, I suppose, if here I can only really begin to think in terms of my own thinking at the moment, which is I've tended to focus recently, well, for some years now, on specifically the writing of the study of text and the teaching of texts. And I've been interested in the idea that you could teach around a scholarship of sacred texts that would allow you to progress through different texts. In other words, you could operate within a sort of recognizable academic discipline that would allow you to achieve some plurality, because you could move to look at different encounters with texts from different traditions, right? So you could, and of course, actually, that's relatively easy within the Judeo-Christian model because it already gives you a plurality of texts, right? There's already, like, at least, I mean, there's not just two, there are multiples. That's not necessarily always the case within all sacred texts. So I don't have comprehensive answers for that, but you certainly can certainly see those patterns emerging. The question is then, okay, what do you get from that, and what do you lose from that? And so a lot of people get worried when I start talking about texts. It's not just about texts.
Absolutely. I mean,
part of me quite deliberately wants to say, just for the sake of the experiment, I'm going to say it is, and I sort of throw it back, but the reason is not really because I want to say it is, but because when I think of encounters with culture and the centrality of that sort of, that particular text, the Bible, in art and music and culture, in buildings, in the development of the philosophy of hermeneutics, which I think must concede that it arose from a more ancient scholarship that was found within a tradition. Let's give Ezra his due when he worked with the Moses myth. Let's recognize the hermeneutics that were going on long before the most recent centuries, right? So I think there is a now. It can't address the questions that are raised by the world religions paradigm, but aren't we going to break that paradigm? Aren't we asking the question of breaking that paradigm? And so the question is, what do you gain and what do you lose?
Yeah,
and rather than
is this the only way or something? I mean, clearly it isn't the only way, and I'm glad that you anticipate the criticism that this is textual, and of course a lot of traditions are not founded on textual texts. So sharing,
although they have narratives, but the narratives may not simply but are not necessarily narratival in a text form. I think many more of them have narratives.
Yeah. But sharing with or engaging with students in the question of what it means to frame a subject around texts, is that not part of the discipline? I mean, I know certainly within the religious studies context, what choices we make, are we talking about material cultures, oral cultures, textual cultures? What does it make a decision like that? How does it shape the production of knowledge, sharing with students, in other words, that knowledge is a production rather than something that sort of we sort of uncover through processes of. So the production of our subject and sharing with students the production of our subject, I think is something that must again be one of the principles upon which we found this new curriculum. And I think we do it anyway. But
I mean, I think we do, but I would use the word the reader, to understand that you are the reader, that the reader matters. The reader is not simply absorbing, is not simply the carrying of propositional knowledge. The reader, the process of being a reader must be absolutely fundamental, because surely that is one of the fundamental educational, what is education? It's about kind of dealing with it, it's about the adaptation of what is known for the current, for the contemporary and the future. We need to we sit in the moment of the of that which we're perceiving now, that which we're being told about before, so that we can cope with what's next. Okay, so we're always in this sort of shadow world of and we need to understand that and the stuff that we're recalling needs to serve us for the future. so that should inform our decisions about selection and prioritization, right? So
well, absolutely. I mean, I think Hannah Arendt uses the phrase "between past and future," that we stand intergenerationally. I mean, to understand education as an intergenerational process, I think, is really, really important. So Hannah Arendt describes the way in which we must stand for our traditions. We must stand for them, warts and all, and that doesn't mean that we're uncritical about them. That doesn't mean that we think that they're the best thing since sliced bread, but that we acknowledge their existence and that they're their formation. And she then says that what the next generation, what the new, she calls it the new natality, what the next generation does with that representation is something we do not control and we cannot control. So it allows for the freedom, the tension, if you like, between affirming our tradition and standing for something and saying, yeah, this isn't perfect, but this is where we are. This is the tradition that we have. And how that then gets transformed with every generation in new unprecedented ways, because education can't be just the reproduction of our traditions in ways that are entirely predictable. So there must always be this kind of fresh reevaluation of how we understand the world. But at the same time, says Arendt, that we have to take responsibility for the world as it is today. And we have to take responsibility for representing the world to the young. And I suppose she's pointing this out because so much within progressive education is about allowing the child to discover without taking any responsibility for the world as it is, allowing kind of student inquiry, so to speak, to be entirely free floating. So anyway, those are a few.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a well. I mean, and yeah, I would be with Arendt, Arendt on everything you said there. And obviously, there's a sort of a bigger question that we could have about the casting of progressive education and discovery learning. And you're talking to someone whose degree was in first degree was in classical civilization, right? So I'm quite interested in the past, and its value for the future. And I suppose I think that it would be in English education there's clearly been this sort of there is clearly this it is deeply unfortunate that it is politically politicized, shall we say, in terms of tradition and knowledge versus progressive and discovery, because it is self-evidently the case that we can do without neither of these, right? So it is a swinging, okay, you can say it's a swinging pendulum, and that's what's been going on. And perhaps that's just the simple reality of change and how we develop. But I just don't think it's very helpful to suggest that sort of either one exhausts what education should be about, for the simple fact of what you were outlining, that that the new generation arrive, they're born into the world, they perceive the world. If we are adults, we walk with them to some extent, as either as teachers or as parents, and we see the world anew through their eyes. And just as we give them a language for speaking about the world and making sense of the world, so they confound it straight away with us by providing novelty, because they are already developing an insight that they become educators to us. And for all in all of the scary ways that sometimes the adult world can educate the children in scary ways, it's a sort of, that's the inevitability of it. So you can't I think it's that's inescapable.
Yeah. Now, I mean, one of the reasons I developed this phrase pedagogical reduction as a way of describing the processes of selection, simplification, and generalization that educators must undertake was precisely because there didn't seem to me to be a general theoretical description of the things we do. I mean, of course, there are curriculum theories in general, but not a more general theory of pedagogical representation and reduction. And indeed, particularly in religious education, we are so worried about reductionism, whereby the representation is regarded skeptically as presented as sufficient, which it can't be sufficient. So being acknowledging the kind of processes of reduction without reductionism is really, I think, fundamental, but also extremely difficult for all the reasons we've been touching on. Whose politics do we respond to? Which stakeholders do we take account of? Which history do we sort of accept is right and wrong? Which racist, colonialist stories or accounts do we follow up with? So that becomes exhausting. So then the question of the principles of pedagogical reduction ultimately address who we are as the person interpreting, who we are, what we bring, and the positionality. So I think it comes back again to this idea of historical consciousness.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, one of the let's call it the technical challenge that that making a success of whatever we would call after religious education or advanced or academic religious education or whatever we try and forge has to address the twin challenge of the multiplicity and diversity of possible routes of inquiry within recognized different disciplinary structures on the one hand, whether that's social sciences, philosophy, theology, and those are summaries of what we could easily divide up. If we were saying theology, are we talking systematic? Are we talking pastoral? Are we talking moral theology? What kind of theology? Post-colonial, liberationist? I mean, sort of let's not kid ourselves that that's a single discipline there. And when we talk about the social sciences, are we going anthropologically or sociologically, or are we interested in psychology? And if so, which kind of psychology? I mean, you could pluralize. You could pluralize each of those. Are we going to be continental about our philosophy? Are we going to be Anglo-American about our philosophy? I mean, so and at the moment, many of those are entertained, and in fact, specifically recognised and acknowledged within the English exam system. It pronounces that it does not, presume a single discipline. It sort of makes an offer to be diverse, although that I think is a slight escapism, because then it raises questions of therefore what constitutes reasonable reason when you're talking about reasoning things through in questions, for example. If you don't have a discipline, what's your reasonable reason? But on the other hand, we have this extraordinary diversity when it comes to the very thing that we're looking at, whether we call them worldviews or religions or traditions. And the double diversity is the technical problem that the current state of religious education needs to meet if it's going to going to advance and or become academic.
Yeah.
That is a tricky one.
Yeah.
Logistically, it's tricky, and in really practical ways, if you maintain your diversity, then you make it very difficult to get specialisms, to develop really sort of confident teachers who have a whole range of techniques that they've mastered, to be able, in terms of what constitutes a sort of, let's say, a sequence of, education, the kinds of questions that they're good at, so which model, which pattern of those can they really get on top of, and secondly, if you're going to resource that, if everybody has something wonderfully different, how do you make it affordable for the publication of resources? Because resources become affordable when they are at scale. So the existence of a national curriculum, arguably, is actually a tool for making it possible for people to produce at scale, and therefore more economically, high quality resources. So you've got this kind of thing of how do you manage the high quality resources if you remain completely diverse, and also how do you get a professional group of teachers who all comfortably occupy similar enough, so this is why you have to concede that there is a limited diversity possible, both in disciplinary terms and in terms of the substance, not without review, and not without updating, but it cannot be wide open. If we want to have some sort of degree of professional identity for teachers and some degree of manageability of curriculum.
I mean, yes, absolutely. I'm conscious of time, and I wanted to. The one more thing I wanted to raise with you, and which is, so what you seem to be hinting, or what the conversation seems to be getting at, is a move away, perhaps, from thinking of the subject in terms of content, as in fields of knowledge, as not that they are entirely, of course, irrelevant, as much as method, as approach, as understanding selves, and how we frame text, how we frame whatever we're framing. So my next question is to do with the idea of a national entitlement that's discussed in the core report. Very quickly, do you think we could create some kind of symposium where we bring together practicing RE teachers, and we develop some sort of, I'm going to call them exemplary materials based on some of the things we've talked about in terms of, recognizing the journey of alienation and historical consciousness, understanding some principles of pedagogical reduction, so on and so forth. And then so bringing together a group of teachers who are in the who are practitioners, who are experts in what they do, which is the pedagogy of religious education, to develop a set of material. Are we at that stage, or is there more to do before we do that?
I think there's certainly movement for that to happen, and actually there's certainly activity underway within the Religious Education Council to try and develop that material. That's certainly the ambition of the REC, to try and develop that. Although I think it's also true to say that there is still considerable debate. I mean, I think it's sort of so for example, there are debate that where the debate, one of the questions is, where does that debate happen, and at the moment I know where it happens, and it happens in different zones. So there is a general conversation that the REC is holding. There are then specific conversations that are going on, particularly with those stakeholders who have responsibility. So, for example, in the Catholic Education Service, they're working on a revised curriculum document to guide Catholic schools in England and Wales. And so one of the questions is, how total can we bring, how at what level can we can we establish some degree of agreement given the historic privileges
Yeah.
and the recent privileges that schools have been given in terms of curriculum independence. So we're kind of in this field where actually schools have been given more curriculum independence, and therefore we're kind of in a new sort of negotiation. However, I think it's a must do. I mean, it's a kind of thing we have to do, and I don't think we can simply wait until we finish doing the theoretical stuff first, because I think that it will happen only through the engagement with the professionals who are working at curriculum design. So it can't simply occupy in a theoretical space. It has to work. It has to work with the pragmatic context engaged profession. So
well, yeah,
yeah.
I mean,
So yes.
I think that's so important. I mean, one of the first sort of principles that I would want to highlight here is what Schleiermacher called the dignity of practice. So one thing that Schleiermacher is not known for is his educational theory, which is very, very developed, very, very interesting. It's only just being translated by some colleagues into English. And I've had a privilege of writing a bit about Schleiermacher's educational theory, and he begins by discussing the dignity of practice. That is to say, parents have been educators long before there was an educational science. Teachers taught long before there was an educational science. Why do we need an educational science? And then he goes on to justify and explain that actually it would be quite useful, but
Yeah.
there is a really vital dignity to practice. And I, as someone who works within a school of education in a university, my research is not so much with teacher educators, but with the theoretical framing of religion in education more generally, not even just in schools, but in general. My own work, I know, is woefully disconnected from the dignity of practice, so to speak, from the curriculum work on the ground. I mean, I am a qualified teacher, but of RE, but I didn't last very long. So I do believe that it's so important that the people who are engaged in the academic study of religion understand some of the political contexts or the curricular contexts for their discussions about how RE ought to be. I mean, there's a very nice sort of conceptual discussion taking place at conferences internationally about the future of RE as a school subject. Sometimes, however, at least from my point of view, it perhaps needs a bit more input from teachers, and I think their expertise is essential. So I'm going to sort of put out there that isn't something that can. So the theoretical research cannot progress without that.
I would agree with that. Absolutely, 100%.
Good. So this is a call to all you viewers. Get in touch if you're interested in being involved, because I think that's something that I'm keen to do, is to develop a forum for teachers to think about what this actually means and what this looks like. It's partly also to help academics to reframe their discussions about the academic study of religion and how RE relates to it.
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to it, and let's see how we can nurture and develop that conversation further with with all of those interested groups, because that would be really valuable. And thanks very much for the conversation. Really interesting conversation. So
thank you, Bob. Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, terrific.